Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about tanking as a warrior and a druid in dungeons for TBC. Now I've done this content as a healer, as a DPS, as a paladin tank, and honestly it's pretty chill. You know, you go in, do some dungeons, get some rep, knock out some badges, and it's a good time. But if you are a warrior or a druid, it can get stressful pretty quickly. You know, if you've ever played any of these classes, you understand that you just don't have the tools to deal with more than 4 mobs at your disposal for these groups with really geared players at this point, right? So if you got pumper DPS, it's a rough time. But there are tools at your disposal, and there are ways to make this manageable and honestly pretty easy. The concept of this video that I want to illustrate to make this a more easy concept for you is threat triage. Now, this is a word that I made up. If someone else uses it, great, but I'm coining it here. Threat triage. It is a way of managing the threat that you have on mobs for your limited tool set to be able to make sure that you keep threat on multiple mobs from a bunch of people doing a bunch of DPS, right? So triage, by definition, is a medical term in which you assess the degree of urgency for treating the wounds of patients, right? You most often see this in a war scenario in which you need to assess the likelihood that someone will survive, or whether or not the resources are going to a place that's going to do the most good for the most amount of people. Ultimately, it's a utilitarian concept philosophically. And this is kind of the same thing, right? You are assessing where your limited threat goes to make sure that you do the most amount of good for your group. So the reason I'm kind of comparing druids and warriors here, lumping them together, is that they have kind of the same tools, right? They have mangle and devastate. These are kind of going to be your main abilities to keep a buff on a target. They have maul and heroic strike to kind of burn their rage. And they have shield slam and thrash, which is kind of a TPS expenditure to try to maintain that aggro, as well as the option for bash and concussive blow that are going to allow you to stun a mob and kind of make it not a threat every 45 seconds or so. Additionally, they have an AoE taunt, and they have about the same type of taunt, single target taunts. This makes it to where, you know, on one target, you're pretty good. If you're doing your rotation properly, you're fine, but anything to 3, 4, 5 targets, this is where things get really dicey, because thunderclap and swipe are just not up to par with keeping up AoE threat, especially if your group is geared. So there are ways to combat this. First things first, you need to make sure you have a UI that is situated for showing you what the threat is on the mobs via their nameplates, whether that's plater, threat plates, an LVUI default. It's going to be the most important thing for you to understand what you need to taunt, what you need to triage, and what you need to build upon. Now, the biggest thing you can do, whether it's a pug, whether it's a guild run, is have a macro to put a skull on a target, right? You are going to be the arbiter of where the DPS is going. And telling them in chat or calling it on comms, it's not going to be effective, because most people are doing these dungeons with their brains firmly in the off position. And it's up to you to kind of steer that as best you can. At some point, you're just herding sheep, and you got to utilize all the tools at your disposal to make sure the sheep are going where they need to go. And that skull marker is going to be key. I keep it on middle mouse button just because I use it a lot. It's one of my most used abilities. In retail, I would have all my movement keys. You know, my monk's roll, my rogue's sprint, my hunter's disengage was middle mouse button, because I used it a lot in emergency situations. In classic, I'm finding with the lack of efficacy of my AoE threat that I need this to direct people more than I need almost anything else. So putting a skull on a target and switching the skull when need be is going to be key in managing the threat of your party. Now that you have the skull and you can kind of be comfortable knowing that all the DPS is going to this specific target, you know, there is going to be errant stuff. You still need to open up with a little bit of AoE, a little bit of thrashes and devastates on other targets. But you want to be dropping those thrashes and the mangles and the shield slams on the skull target, because that's when you're going to need to keep the most threat on. Not just initial threat, not just pool variance, but the most threat on. But that's where triage comes in, right? You need to start building that lead on other mobs as well. And so if you can kind of assess where mobs are as far as when they're going to die, you can comfortably move off of a target. So your skull target, when it gets to 40%, if you've got kind of a 10% threat lead and you think that you're not going to lose threat till about 25-ish% on the mob, that's triage, baby. You just let it go, because that thing's going to die before it does any damage, right? And in that time that you've gotten off the mob and it has lost threat from you and it has ran to someone else, maybe it hits them once, but it's not going to kill them. It's just a mob in a dungeon. If you can time it right, if you get a good feel for it, you're already on the next mobs. You're already moving the skull when that mob dies, and you've already built up the threat, and it just makes it easier. Now, the hardest part is that variance on the pool. It is making sure you have aggro on all of these things. It's using your taunt and your stuns effectively, right? So if you're on skull and someone pulls off of you on another mob, it's important that you taunt it back, right? And you continue to build threat on the skull, you know? If you don't have taunt available, you can stun. Maybe you taunt the second mob, you stun the third mob. You build up a little bit on the skull, and then while you have that lead on the skull, you make sure that you build up threat on the stunned mob. That way, when it becomes unstunned, it goes back to you. You throw out a little thing on the taunted mob because you've already gained TPS from the taunt, and you go back to skull. And then you kind of just assess based on what the most emergency situation is, right? And don't get me wrong, there are emergency situations. In situations in which you have no taunt, you have no stun, and you're losing threat, you know, you have intervene as a warrior, or you have your feral charge as a druid. And, you know, there's no set flow chart of what exactly you need to do in any situation, because pool to pool it's going to be different, group to group DPS is going to be different, damage patterns are going to be different, the ability to triage different mobs is going to be different based on the amount of damage they do. And so it's going to be something you have to fill out, but make sure you understand that these are the tools you have and use them at will, right? And use them effectively. I really want to highlight the importance of this triage concept, you know? It gets really stressful, and there's a lot of things to kind of make snap decisions on, snap judgments on, what to stun, what to taunt, when to intervene, when to feral charge, when to AoE taunt, when things really hit the fan. But if you implement this concept of triage, you can basically do half of the work by doing nothing, and it's beautiful.
I did nothing. I did absolutely nothing, and it was everything that I thought it could be.
And it's going to be something you have to feel out. But once you understand how it works, you're going to have a lot more time mentally to make these decisions, and it's going to be a lot less stressful of an environment for you. Thanks for watching, guys. This one was fun to make. I know there's going to be a lot of tanks out there in the coming weeks that are trying to get attuned, helping people get attuned, farming badges for resist gear, or just leveling alts. And you know, I hope this inspires some confidence or sheds some light on some tools in your toolbox to make it a less stressful experience for you. So like it if you liked it, subscribe. It really goes a long way to getting picked up by the algorithm, and you'll see more content like this. So I appreciate your time, guys. This was a fun one to make, and I'll see you in the next one.